Hi, this is Eric for Ochoy. In this video, we're going to take a look at working with the Octane operator texture nodes. And for this video, I'm using the machinery 01.ma scene. So in this scene, we have just our weird little machine here. And I'm going to select this panel and create a glossy material for it. And let's bring in a texture. So I'll click on the checkerboard next to diffuse. I'm going to go to Octane Textures, Image, and I'll choose Octane Float Image Texture. And I'm going to bring in the texture called Panel Bump, just because this is a nice kind of grayscale image texture with a little bit of detail to it. So this is the result we see on our panel. So I'm going to use the operator nodes as a way to kind of adjust the colors in this texture. But notice I used a float image texture, so all the values are grayscale. So I'm not necessarily going to go in order here because these textures are listed in alphabetical order. I want to choose kind of more of a logical way to approach this, going for some of the easier textures to understand to some of the ones that are a little bit more complex. So let's start with a simple mix texture. So I'm going to click on Octane Mix. This blends two different textures based on an amount. And let's go to the Octane texture nodes, and I'm going to create two RGB spectrum texture nodes. So whenever I'm kind of exploring and comparing different textures, I like to use red and green textures since they are complementary colors, and it's kind of obvious what's going on when you plug them into different inputs. So I have a red and green texture. Let's actually name these. So this one we'll call green, and this one we'll call red. And I'm going to select my mix texture here and put green in texture slot 1 and red in texture slot 2. And then if I just simply plug this into diffuse, we're going to get a yellow texture because in computer graphics, red plus green equals yellow. So now what I can do is I can use the slider to adjust the amount. So if I want to have more green, I'll move it towards 0. If I want to have more red, I'll turn it towards 1. Everything in between blends into 2 together, pretty straightforward. So now what I can do is, rather than just using a float value for the amount, I can middle mouse button drag our grayscale texture here, and you'll see that the light and dark values of the textures map the red and green colors to the surface. So this is the result. So for the amount input on a mixed texture, you could use image textures like I've done right here, or you could use procedural textures such as the dirt texture or fall off texture and so on. So it's a great way to blend two textures together. And of course, you can also put other mixed textures into these texture slots so you can start to create a hierarchy of a very complex blend of multiple textures together. So you can make it as complex as you like. So if we go back down here to operator nodes, let's take a look at Cosine Mix. Cosine Mix is extremely similar. The only difference is the algorithm used to determine the mix. It's based on a cosine wave as opposed to a straight up blend. So I'm going to put the exact same image texture here into the amount slider, and I'm going to put green in texture 1 and red in texture 2. Let's move this over here so it's more obvious. So right now what we have is a regular mix texture is plugged into the diffuse. If I replace that with the cosine mix, you can see when it updates, we get a slightly different type of mixing here. The greens are a bit more vibrant. So those colors or those values in the amounts image that are closer to the extremes of 1 or 0 are going to see more of a difference than those in the middle because it's based on a cosine wave rather than a straight up blend. So subtle difference in some cases, could be more extreme in others, depends on how you use the node, but that's the main difference. So let's get rid of these mixed nodes for a moment. And let's take a look at add, multiply, and subtract. So these are similar to blend nodes that you might encounter when you're working with, say, like Photoshop or something like that. So I'm going to click on the Add Texture node and multiply and subtract. Let's zoom in here a little bit. So let's move these out of the way for a moment. Let's just look at Add. So for the Add node for Texture 1, I'm going to middle mouse button drag our grayscale image map. And for Texture 2, I'm going to plug in green. And then put the texture output into the diffuse of our glossy material. And you can see that the green is being added to our grayscale image map. So if we just look at the grayscale image map, that's what it looks like normally. If we look at what happens when we add our green color to that texture map, you can see that it gets kind of a lightened values. So all the dark values in our texture map are having green added to it. So it's creating a lightness to the image while at the same time tinting it green. So let's take a look at multiply. So same thing here. I'm going to middle mouse button drag our image texture into texture 1, middle mouse button drag green into texture 2, and then let's put the texture output into diffuse. In this case, we get kind of the opposite effect. So the lighter ones are becoming tinted darker green, and the dark values are also becoming darkish green. And then finally, let's take a look at subtract. So I'm going to middle mouse button drag our texture map into texture 1, and then our green color into texture 2. And let's put the texture output into diffuse. And you can see in this case it's being subtracted. So rather than tinting it green, it's being tinted by the complement to that green color, which is this kind of purplish value. So I'm going to reconnect our add texture to the diffuse channel of that glossy node. And let's get rid of multiply and subtract. Just delete those for the moment. So now we're back to our image texture being added with that green color. Let's take a look at color correct. So I'm going to click on the color correct texture. This is a pretty straightforward texture. It just allows you to adjust things like brightness, gamma correction, hue, saturation, and contrast. And you can also invert the texture. So I'm going to actually, rather than color correct our float image texture, I'm going to color correct the output of that add texture and then plug that into the diffuse. So I'm going to select my color correct texture here, middle mouse button drag that add texture into the texture input, and then connect the texture output to the diffuse channel of our glossy material. So let's do this, make it a little bit easier to see. So image texture, green color, add texture, color correct node being plugged into diffuse. So if I select my color correct texture, I can do things like, if I adjust the hue correction, I'm going to change the hue. So that green is going to be set to a different color. If I adjust the gamma correction, I'll set this to say 2. You can see that it's adjusting the mid values of the output. Let's set the hue correction back to 0. So go back to green. So let's set this back to 1. I think this is, for the most part, pretty straightforward. We can bring down the overall brightness, change the saturation, and adjust the contrast. So it's just a straight up color correction node like you'd find in any compositing program. Pretty straightforward and extremely useful. Especially if you want to use one texture for, say, 2 different inputs. So let's say you had a grayscale texture that you wanted to use for both the roughness and, say, the bump, but you wanted to have different qualities to them. You can have a color correction node on the output for the grayscale texture, then going into roughness, and a different color correction node from the same texture going into bump or something like that. Let's take a look at the gradient texture. I'm going to click on this gradient texture right here, and it requires an input texture in order to tell Octane how to actually map the gradient onto the surface. So let's start by connecting this to diffuse. So I'll connect this to the diffuse channel of that glossy material that's applied to the panel. Now for my input texture, I'm going to go to geometric and click on fall off. So I think this will make it obvious to see how the gradient actually works. I'm going to middle mouse button drag the fall off texture into input texture here. And you can see that it's now shading that surface based on the facing ratio of the model to the camera. So if you take a look at the gradient itself, at the moment it's just blending black and white. And it's not very obvious how the gradient is working right here. So what we need to do is we have to add some colors and position to the gradient. So I'm going to click on this 3 times. And each of these positions are a color point on a ramp. So you don't see a visualization of the ramp, but you do see sort of a numeric input. So if I put this position to 1, then I'm on one side of the gradient. If I put this one to 0.5, I'm in the middle of the gradient, and then at 0, I'm at the other end. So now I'm going to add some colors. So I'll add red for the 1 position, green for the 0.5 position, and blue for the 0 position. So now as I rotate the view, you can see how those colors are mapped based on the facing ratio. So the fall off is controlling the gradient, which is connected to the diffuse channel. If I select the icon here, you can kind of see how that looks. So you can adjust the gradient several different ways. Let's get to a more better angle here. So I can, of course, adjust the positions here numerically. See if I can bring some more red down into the gradient. As I'm increasing the red, we're seeing more yellow, of course, because it's mixing with the green. So you can see more orange there, orangish yellow. Another thing that I can do is adjust the fall-off texture itself to change the way that it's determining the gradient on the surface. So we could actually adjust the skew factor and also minimum and maximum values. If we set the mode to normal versus 90 degrees, we can adjust the direction of the fall off by changing the fall off direction. So if I set this to like 0.5 and this to 0, you can see the colors on the centerpiece right here are kind of turning around as I change that fall off direction. So that's another way you can adjust the gradient. You can also try normal versus vector 180 degrees, which is kind of similar, but instead of 90 degrees, it's using 180. So let's set this back to normal versus iRay. Click on the Octane gradient texture. Let's take a look at the interpolation menu. You have a choice between constant, linear, and cubic. So if I set this to constant and start to rotate around to change the incidence angle, you can see I'm getting much more of a harder edge between the colors and the gradient, between the red and the green. Linear, it's a bit smoother. And cubic is even smoother still. So you can change those depending on the type of look that you're going for. So now let's take a look at the compare texture. So click on compare here. Let's move this around so it's a little bit easier to see. Okay, so if I click on the compare texture in the attribute editor, we can see we have 2 inputs and then 2 comparisons which give us a result. So I'm going to middle mouse button drag our image texture into input A, and I'm going to leave input B at just a straight up value, so a float value controlled by this slider. And now these 2 sliders control the result. So I'm going to middle mouse button drag the green texture into the slot for if A is less than B. And then I'm going to middle mouse button drag the red texture into if A is greater than or equal to B. So these are the results and this is the comparison. Now let's take the texture output and connect it to the diffuse channel of our glossy material here. So you can see here is the result in the diffuse channel. And now what I can do is I can take my compare texture here, and I can start to adjust the slider. And essentially what it's doing is it's looking at the values in the input A texture, which is our grayscale bitmap texture, and it's looking at this value, and for each pixel value in the texture, it's comparing that value with this value right here. And if that value is, say, less, so if the value in the texture map is less than this value, then it's putting the green color in there. And if the value in the texture map is greater than this value, then it's putting red in there, right? So if A is less than B, green. If A is greater than or equal to B, then red. So now I can move this slider around, and you can see it adjusts those colors based on that comparison. So you could put two textures in here. It's an interesting way to blend two different textures, and you can get some really cool results with it. But that's the basic idea behind compare. Now let's take a look at the clamp texture. So add clamp, and let's put the texture output into input here, so the input texture, and then let's middle mouse button drag this to the diffuse channel of our material. Let's get rid of the compare texture so it's easy to follow what's going on. And now what we can do is we can go to the clamp texture and start to adjust our minimum and maximum values. So this is another way to do some color correct. So now we're saying we're adjusting those minimum dark values. I could pull them up, and I can pull down the maximum light values. Of course, now they're kind of crisscrossed, so it's not making much sense. But it's basically clamping the values. I could even put the green texture in the minimum and the red texture in the maximum, and you get this kind of thing. So another way to go about doing this is I'm clamping the values, and I could put a color correct texture in between the float image texture, or in other words our bitmap, and in the input of the clamp texture. So let's do that. So middle mouse button, drag this over to texture, and then put texture output into input. And now what I can do is I can use that color correction node and adjust things like the brightness and gamma. So it's adjusting the output of that bitmap, which is then clamping the colors, the output colors, the clamp texture to this green and red. So we get green and yellow as a result. You can even turn on invert. You're just kind of playing with values to see what you come up with. The last texture in the operator group is invert, and I think that's pretty self-explanatory. Let's get rid of all of these. And if I put texture, a middle mouse button drag our image map into the texture slot, and then put this out to diffuse, then it's inverting the texture. Pretty straightforward. You also have an invert option here on the texture itself. So you can either use that, or in some cases, if you're building a complex node tree and you want to maybe use the same image map for two different inputs, but you need the reverse of it, that's when an invert node can become very useful. You'll also find an invert option on the color correct node right here. So it's just there for convenience. So that is the operator nodes in the Octane texture section.